Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning from wherever you may be tuning in. Welcome to this WSET Bitesize webinar on understanding Rakı, the iconic Turkish spirit. My name is Deniz Bayram. I am an educator at WSET School London, and I am also of Turkish heritage, which is why it gives me a great pleasure and some right to talk about the national beverage, the national alcoholic beverage of Turkey. So as you're tuning in, if you can just pop in the chat box, where are you tuning in from? I'm sure we're going to get quite a few people tuning in from Turkey itself. And you are hopefully joining us with a glass of rakı beside yourself. And before that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get to the main topic of this evening. Let's see who are coming from. Many people are coming from Istanbul. We have Vancouver, Canada, quite a lot from Canada, Argentina, the USA, Guatemala as well. What an eclectic mix. That's brilliant. So I'm sure that most of you have heard of the WSET before, but in a nutshell, the Wine and Spirits Education Trust is the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wines, spirits, beer, and sake. WSET has over 50 years of experience in designing and delivering education to help both wine professionals and consumers, as well as enthusiasts, to learn more about wine, spirits, and sake, and now beer as well. You can take WSET qualifications in over 70 countries through a network of more than 800 course providers. If you're interested in finding out more about embarking on a WSET journey, you can visit wsetglobal.com to find your nearest course provider. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and will be available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. If you have questions, please, if you can put them in the Q&A box, and we will try to cover as many as possible at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, let's get into discovering what Rakı is. So Rakı is really the ethereal, evocative, and that milky white glass of Turkish culture that most of you or may have observed in Turkey if you've ever taken a trip there or outside, because Rakı's reputation is pretty much global. There is really no spirit, other spirits in the world, which is so closely associated with national identity while embraced in the lives of the people, the very people of the nation at the same time. Rakı is widely mentioned in Turkish history and pretty much embedded in its literature as well. And from our listeners who are tuning in from Turkey, and given the current mood of some of us may be carrying these days, it may be a little unusual to be giving a webinar on Rakı, but I genuinely believe that speaking about Rakı at times like this can mean actually much more than just talking about a drink. So let's get into what is Rakı. Rakı is essentially a flavored spirit made from grapes and aniseed, to put it in the most simplest context. It has to be made in Turkey, and that's one of the most important aspects of Rakı legislation when we're going to cover it in a second. Rakı is actually the only alcoholic beverage in Turkey that is protected by a PDO, protected designation of origin law. This means that no wine in Turkey, in fact, is not protected by PDO, but Rakı is. That sort of gives you an idea of how significant this beverage is in Turkish culture. And these laws were certified in 2009. And what Rakı laws dictate is that it can only be made in Turkey from only Turkish materials. They have to be sourced from Turkey. It's a very national beverage, which is also protected by that national aspect. And what makes Rakı different from other aniseed-based spirits, which we will cover shortly in the next few slides, that it has to use grapes as its main base, which is not the same case for some of the other common suspects with aniseeds around the world. And it is pretty much a, combination of all of the cultural heritage that present Turkey holds today. In fact, in the legal registration, it was recognized as representing a synthesis of the cultural heritage of various civilizations that have lived on the lines of Anatolia. To talk about Rakı's brief history, to give you a bit of a background, because it's tough to shorten this history. Rakı doesn't really have a brief history. But when we talk about modern Rakı today, its history dates back over 500 years. But when we really get to the essence of Rakı, it could be one of the descendants of the very first distilled alcoholic spirit of the humankind, because it comes from the Mesopotamian tradition of distillation, which is closely connected to the Arab culture, as they were the first ones to come up with the technical aspect of how to distill alcohol. In fact, rakı comes from the Arabic word arak, which means to sweat, which refers to the drip by drip distillation, condensation that comes out of the still. And it's a blanket name. A form of arak is given as a blanket name to all of these spirits that can trace their tradition back to that Arabic tradition of early distillation. In in the Ottoman Empire and in Turkey today as well, it started out also as a byproduct of winemaking because wine has to precede distillation. We have to make wine first to be able to distill it into alcohol. And oftentimes what the culture demanded is to utilize everything you can from your raw material, in this case, the grapes. So what they did was they actually took the leftovers from winemaking and distilled them to make raku as a starting point of this tradition in rural Anatolia. And over the course of centuries, it has significantly evolved into many different shapes. Its taste varied historically. Before it became a aniseed, heavy aniseed forward beverage, it had different flavors as well, such as mastic, which you may be familiar with. That's grown very commonly in the Eastern Mediterranean, and many other herbs as well. But around the 19th century onwards, especially in the Ottoman Empire, together from the Mesopotamian impact that it took, especially around the regions of Lebanon and Syria, it started to become more homogeneously distilled and flavored with aniseed. In Turkey, in the early 20th century until the 21st century, rakı was only produced by the state monopoly of the Turkish Republic, which had a monopoly over all alcoholic beverage production. And until then, there were many rakı producers during the Ottoman empires, but with the outset of the Turkish Republic, it came under really one producer until the 21st century when the state monopoly was dissolved and private production and distillation of rakı was permitted, which gave to higher quality levels inevitably, and also more variety around different distillation methods of rakı or using different sorts of takes on the aniseed or even the raw materials, such as using different kinds of grape varieties. But what made arak and rakı really stick and persist in mostly Muslim cultures, which inherently actually prohibits drinking of alcohol, was the aniseed itself, because aniseed rakı existed for a very long time, and it survived even as a drink itself, thanks to aniseed's medicinal purposes and its wide use for medicine in the Middle East. And thanks to this, rakı today has remained over centuries, and that's one of the primary reasons why aniseed is the main flavoring today. So let's take a look at rakı in some figures. There are around 40 million bottles of Rakı made and sold every year in Turkey, which is not that much when you compare it to other distilled beverages around Europe. But most of it is consumed in Turkey, and no producer produces more than the local consumption. So there's a very fine line between how much Rakı is being made and how much of it's being consumed. Uh, Rakı inherently as a beverage distillate is not a spirit that is meant for extended aging, so that the numbers reflect that as well. No more than 10% of Rakı is actually exported outside of Turkey, which again shows us this really strong tradition of domestic consumption. Rakı is very much a part of national identity, and people drink it. Although it is not the most popular drink, alcoholic drink in Turkey, in fact, it is the second one after beer. Beer is by far the largest one. However, it is for now in the second place, but it can in the future fluctuate between second and third as wine consumption, as well as other spirits, are threatening Rakı's throne when it comes to the main alcoholic spirit that is consumed in Turkey. In fact, Rakı is losing market share as we speak right now, domestically, quite rapidly to whiskey, to Scotch whiskey, because of recent high taxation is now making whiskey seem more reasonably priced on the shelf compared to Rakı. So many people have started to move away to to whiskey from Rakı, which is a trend that may threaten Rakı in the future. There are only 16 distillers permitted to distill Rakı in Turkey, and one is responsible for over 80% of the volume. And our Turkish speakers and people tuning in from Turkey have no doubt what that producer is, which producer that is. But even that one distiller produces many different kinds of and lines of Rakıs made from different grapes and different production methods. So the variety in Turkey regarding Rakı today has been is in a place where it's never been before. It's as diverse as we've never seen before. So if you have done any of our WSET spirits qualifications, we have a four-step procedure in analyzing the production method of spirits. First of all, we need to focus on the raw materials. The raw materials of Rakı are fresh grapes. The main ones are grapes and aniseeds, but they are not the only ones. And we have to be very precise about what these raw materials are. And the protected designation of origin laws in Turkey also are very specific about what these are. Grapes can be fresh or dried, and they need to be fermented, obviously, to create alcohol. Traditionally, this used to be leftover of winemaking. Today, that doesn't have to be the case. Grapes can be grown solely to produce Rakı at the end. Aniseed needs to be precisely Mediterranean aniseed, which is the species of Pimpinella anisum. And water can be used to either dilute it during fermentation or perhaps after to dilute. Agricultural ethyl alcohol is permitted for certain styles of Rakı that may not be considered the very highest complexity and highest levels of quality. And sugar can be added in certain points of production. Let's take a look at some of the most common grape varieties that are used to ferment Rakı distillate. The most common one is Sultaniye, which is sultanas, essentially, also known as stumps and seedless. Sultanas are very high in sugar content and not that high in their acidity, so they make great musts to ferment and distill into Rakı. And it is by far the most widely planted grape variety in Turkey, mainly destined for raisin production, but also for Rakı. Muscat, also known as Misket or Muscat Blanc Petit Grain, is a aromatic variety that can sometimes be produced into Rakı, especially for more high-end or craft producers that may want to make more characterful spirits that have more aromas from the grape itself. And black grapes can also be used for Rakı distilling. Boğazkere, which literally translates into throat scraper, is one of the most common ones out of the local black varieties. It's not really favored for, historically, it wasn't as favored for winemaking because of its really high tannins and the thick skins. That's not really the case anymore in winemaking. However, that's why there's a historic tradition of using Bois grapes for Rakı distilling as well. Let's take a look at our aniseed, which is a crucial part of Rakı. Aniseed Pimpinella anisum is indigenous to West Asia. So when we think about Rakı and the Mesopotamian, the Arabic tradition of distillation, it is very much interconnected because of that reason. Today, it is found across the Mediterranean very much endemically. That's why we're not really surprised to find these aniseed flavored spirits in places around the Mediterranean. And we'll cover those places at the end of the session, places like France, Italy, and even Greece and Spain. It is known for its medicinal properties. Like I say, it may have been one of the reasons why Rakı survived throughout the centuries, even in Muslim majority nations. And the magic of Rakı comes from aniseed, because aniseed has a compound called anethole, which is the oil that the aniseed has. And that oil is not soluble with water, but it is soluble with alcohol. So it will not dissolve in a bottle when there's alcohol, but when there's enough water in the environment, it will suspend and it will create that signature louching effect that gives Rakı its milky white color. And in Turkey, since Rakı has to use Turkish aniseed, Turkish grown aniseed, most of it is largely grown in the western part of the country. When it comes to distillation, sorry, before moving into distillation, fermentation, we have to ferment first to get our alcohols. Fermentation of grapes for Rakı production is quite interesting because this is the bit that differs Rakı from its other cousins, aniseed flavored cousins. Fermentation starts with fermenting our fresh or dried grapes, either with mixing it water if there's not enough juice in them to make a watery wash to be able to ferment. And then we ferment them into 6 to 9% alcohol by volume, very crude wine. And during this process, addition of sugars is allowed, which is called chaptalization, if we want to increase the alcohol level of our ferment, particularly in early harvest grape varieties or in dried grape pomaces and raisins. Chaptalization is quite commonplace. Traditionally, open and long fermentations, doesn't which makes Rakı quite special traditionally because this is very similar to some of the other spirits that we may find around the world. So it is a fermentation process that's closer in character to spirits like mezcal or Jamaican rum in a way, where there's a lot of oxidation and a lot of different yeasts fermenting, and it can be quite a long fermentation. So the resulting wine that we make is far from neutral, which has a lot of the grape character that we get, and as well as some other characters that may add complexity, but also negatively, possibly some impurities as well. But at the end, we have to do distillation. And when we talk about the distillation, that's where the second signature aspect of Rakı production comes into place. And essentially, if you take a look at a fermenting Rakı wash, it will look like almost a orange wine fermentation because we find skins, seeds, even stems sometimes in the ferment to get more of the aromas and all of those beautiful flavor compounds from the grape skins. And this is called maishe in Turkish, and this is essentially at the end of the fermentation, ready to be distilled into what we called suma, which forms the backbone of Rakı production. And by the way, if you try to do a bit of research or talk to Rakı distillers about their fermentation methods, they are not likely to share much because this is a very secret. It's a process that is usually veiled with a lot of secrecy. not because certain practices may be questionable here, but they are more likely to focus on the second aspect of production, which is distillation, which gives Rakı its unique aromas at the end of the day, which is aniseed. Distillation. Turkish law states that Rakı must be double distilled to a minimum. And some producers prefer to triple distilled, but it has to be minimum of double distillation. The first step is the summa distillation, where we put our fermented liquid into the still. This is akin to some of the spirits where we do a bit of a stripping run initially to get rid of most of those volatile compounds and get rid of most of the water. And this is the distillation of the summa, which is the resulting liquid that we get, which is around 65 to 70% alcohol by volume. And we can liken this to low wines, or even if you did some of our qualifications in Brandy de Jerez, they can have a more low alcohol distillate called Holandas, and it could come into a similar point with those metaphors as well. But we have to do a second distillation, which is the key stage here for Rakı, because the second distillation is not only to further purify the summa without taking too much away from that grape aroma and flavor that Turkish Rakı is signature for, but we also do it with aniseed in the still. Turkish Rakı has to be aniseed flavored through second distillation with aniseeds. We cannot use any other formats of infusion, for example, like we may do it for gin production. They're not allowed for Rakı production. There's only one correct way, and that is to redistill during the second distillation with aniseeds. This is where we extract the anethol, and we always, just like in any other traditional spirits of the world, are extracting the hearts of the distillate, which are referred to as the belly in Turkish, known as the göbek. And this has recently become a marketing catchphrase, although there cannot be any Rakı that's not coming from the belly, because otherwise it would have quite a lot of volatile compounds that would make the Rakı very harsh, potentially even unsafe. So pretty much every Rakı is belly Rakı, even though some are using this term additionally to market their Rakı. And then we can do an optional third distillation, which is not mandatory, but quality producers may elect to do it if they want to purify their Rakı to a smoother results. It's not necessarily a better Rakı, but it's going to be one that's going to be highly rectified, perhaps less of those complexity aromas and flavors that we may get in some of the other Rakıs. Not necessarily better, but can make a more pure, more round, a softer Rakı. And then post distillation, which is our final stage, we dilute to bottling strength with water, and only up to 10 grams per liter sugar may be added at the very end. Rakı is not really known for its sweetness compared to other aniseed flavored spirits around the Mediterranean. And that's because you're not really allowed to add much of it. And the producers who end up adding quite a lot of sugar are usually the mass production Rakı houses. And the way they do it is, since their ferment is probably not the most controlled ferment, and the distillation may end up getting more of those impurities in the belly of the distillation, they may want to round up some of those impurities by adding some sugar and masking them with a bit of sugar. However, by Turkish law, unfortunately, no Rakı can be labeled as low or no sugar. So many producers indicate that they don't add sugar to their Rakı by simply saying this Rakı is only made by summa and water and aniseed. Rakı has to be aged minimum of 30 days. A resting period is required by law before bottling. This gives Rakı a little bit of a chance to smoothen itself out, which can happen even in stainless steel tanks. Although oak barrel maturity is very rare, but becoming more and more common lately, even short periods of oak maturation can give Rakı more smoother, more rounder mouthfeel before release. And there are some really rare releases of premium Rakıs that may age much longer in oak barrels, similar to, for example, bourbon or whiskey, where they get more influence from the oak barrels and change their color. But these are more modern styles. Let's take a look at the aniseed flavored family because when we talk about Rakı, it being an aniseed flavored spirit, it's very natural for us to think of its very close relatives. And probably Rakı's closest relatives are Arak from Lebanon and the Greater Levant, and Ouzo from Greece, which makes sense because they are, after all, neighbors of close neighbors of Turkey. Arak essentially is really the closest relative of modern day Rakı in Turkey, perhaps a little bit closer than Ouzo. Arak is essentially distilled in a very similar way. However, it is not dictated, mandated by law to be only grape sourced, although it is usually mostly grape must distillate. Whereas Ouzo is definitely in the most common examples, not only grape distillate source, but also the flavoring is not only aniseed. Most ouzos are a combination of aniseed and fennel seeds, which is the most popular one in addition to aniseeds. And there are very different kinds of ouzos. You can get more ouzos that are more rakı-like, because I mean ouzo and arak, they were all part of the Ottoman Empire, and they were produced under the same empire, so they have very close relationships. So there are many varieties of ouzo in that sense. But ouzo is not as much of a national drink as it is in Greece, as rakı is in Turkey. In fact, in Greece, ouzo is mostly seen as a more old-fashioned drink, where the younger generation associates it with them, their grandparents and their great-grandparents mostly drinking it, and the recent generations are more focusing on wines and beer. Sambuca in Italy is again a aniseed flavored liqueur. I'm calling it a liqueur because Sambuca has a significant amount of added sugar. In fact, even the consumption method is completely different than arak and ouzo and rakı. Sambuca is oftentimes either consumed as a digestif after dinner, after lunch, or most famously served with espresso, which is also known as espresso corretto, corrected espresso, where it accompanies a shot of espresso, making it corrected. And finally, France. We can't not talk about pastis and absinthe because perhaps pastis is one of the closer ones to Rakı in terms of how commonly it is drunk in the country that it's being produced in. Pastis is synonymous with the south of France, particularly. And pastis is, again, much sweeter than Rakı, perhaps not as Sambuca, but it doesn't only have aniseed and it has many other array of herbs that are infused as well. Whereas absinthe is many, many herbs. And absinthe is probably the furthest relative of Rakı, and it comes in a much, much higher strength. And obviously absinthe has many historical mystical connotations behind it, as you may know. But essentially, all four of these and five of these spirits are in different senses and different distances relatives of Turkish Rakı. But what about Rakia or Rakiu, which is very commonly found in the Balkans? And every Balkan country today may have their own version of this rakia. Rakia is not rakı, only the name similarity may ring a bell, but rakia is usually grape distillate, and where the similarities end is it is never, almost never, redistilled with aniseed. So it is not aniseed flavor. Rakia can be described as a heritage of the Ottoman Empire on the Balkans, and that's why the name also rings quite a bell. But it is closer to grappa in Italy, where it's very much a grape distillate, or also palinka in Hungary, than it is to aniseed flavored spirits. They are delicious, but they are much less about aniseed. And the closest thing to rakia would be Zvania in Cyprus, which is also, again, a grape distillate, usually not flavored with aniseed. We have to talk about Rakı in food culture because Rakı, as being such a nationally significant spirit, is actually very much a cultural aspect of Turkish life. Rakı has its own manners, it has its own rules, historically, most importantly. But I would say the most significant aspect of Rakı culture is its food pairings. Rakı and fish may be one of the most common, the most popular, however, one of the most divisive pairings as well in the history of modern Turkey. And when we mean rakı and fish, there are two types of fish that are commonly paired with rakı: fresh, grilled, or fried fish, and cured fish. And in my personal opinion, and this is where things get a bit divisive, and I'm sure I'm going to ruffle some feathers here, rakı is not a natural pairing with fresh fish, but a impeccable pairing with cured fishes. And this is where there's a lot of, unfortunately, divisiveness in Turkey. People drink rakı with fresh grilled fish. These Mediterranean fishes, such as sea bream and branzino, and even sardines. However, Rakı is way too strong for the very delicate flavors of these fishes. So what happens is it's a bit like trying to slow dance with someone who insists on tap dancing. Essentially, Rakı really takes over the fresh fish, and it's not quite possible to enjoy the subtleties of the fish when you pair it with Rakı, although it is very much a sacred and popular pairing today in Turkey. But what fish really goes effortlessly with Rakı is cured fish, particularly salt cured fishes of Turkey. If you go to a Turkish taverna, and which are called as meyhanes in Turkey, you will see salted fishes. They can be salted big bonitos, which are very sort of a mid-sized tuna in a sense, which are very salty but very high in umami as well, or salted mackerel, which is a salted and dried mackerel, which are very delicious dishes to pair with raku. They pair really well with raku because both of them have very strong flavors and they combine beautifully on the palate. Raka and meze is a natural pairing, especially when mezes have quite a lot of salt, a lot of garlic, a lot of oil. So things like caciki in Greece is known as cacık in Turkey. Quite a lot of very heavy, salty, and spicy vegetables and herbs like dill are used, and they're very natural pairings with raka because of those very intense aromas that they have. And finally, raka and fruit. Raka and fruit is a perfect pairing because fruit has a lot of sugar and quite aromatized as well. And it sort of ends up being quite a beautiful pairing with raka, adding a bit of sweetness. The most popular one is undoubtedly the white melon, the honeydew melon. In fact, when you combine it with the Turkish white cheese, which is a very close relative of Greek feta, the saltiness and the sweet coming in from a cold piece of honeydew melon with a sip of raka is probably one of the most quintessential, one of the most classic pairings that you must try if you have never tried before next time you travel to Turkey. And finally, I shall commit a more grave heresy here after saying perhaps raka and fresh fish is not quite the best or most ideal pairing. Raka can make some lovely cocktails, even though being such a traditionally and nationally embraced spirit, many people have very reserved thoughts about making cocktails from Rakı. Rakı culture can be quite conservative in terms of preserving the traditions of how it is drunk. But in modern times, Rakı can show its flexibility by making great cocktails. given that that fresh, beautiful licorice like aniseed aroma and flavor pairs really well with many fruits. Fruit-based cocktails are definitely the common options here. And I quite like the perhaps the most popular example, which is mixing it with cucumber and lime juice. It's known as the Turkish haze, and it's absolutely perfect. So it's a bit of like a glass of rakı that you would usually dilute with water for the louching, and add a bit of ice, but you top that with some cucumber and lime juice. A bit like a meze with rakı in your glass, in the same glass. Raspberry Crush, if you like berries, raku, especially that aniseed flavor, tends to pair really well with blackberries and red berries as well. And finally, Bosphorus. And I think this is more of a savory, very much a meze imitating cocktail. Very creative. I quite like it. Carrot, turmeric, and a bit of Turkish touch there with the rose water, mixing with some mineral water, is probably one of the cocktails that you should recommend to your friends who may believe that you can never make cocktail from Rakı or you shouldn't make cocktail from Rakı. You can, and it can be very delicious. And that brings us to the end of what I have got to say about Raku. And I'm sure that many of you have added some questions into our Q&A box. I think most of them went to our chat box. So let's go into our chat box and see what we have. So some people have asked about which percentage of alcohol is Raku bottled in. Raku has to be a minimum of 40% alcohol and in bottling. That's mandated by law. So you cannot have Raku that's below 40%. Let's see. And many people have named said the names of those cured fish mezes dishes. One of them is lakarda, which is the salt brine cured small bonito or big bonito or small tuna. Someone said chiros, which is the salt and air dried mackerel that we have, especially in Istanbul. And trying to see if I can get to the Q&A box here. There we go. Someone asked, will the WSET initiate a certification program for Rakı in the foreseeable future? Well, I'm not sure about how soon that would be, but it would be quite nice to delve deeper into aniseed flavored spirits of the world for sure. And someone asked, Rakı is considered a spirit and not wine? Correct. You're very right. Although it is perhaps one of the most wine-like aniseed flavored spirits compared to the other examples that we find around the Mediterranean. And someone said, just a note from Slovenia, rakia in various Balkan countries might or might not be from grapes. It's a very generic term for fruit spirit. That is very correct. And that again comes from the tradition of rakia or rakı relating to the distillate itself from the Arabic tradition. But it can certainly be made from grapes, but most commonly people also make it from plums. I've seen people make them from pears as well, and even figs, which is actually a tradition in Turkey, parts of Anatolia. What is the most common way of serving rakı? The most common way of serving rakı would be simply diluting it with some water and adding a couple of cubes of ice, although some people don't prefer to dilute their rakı with ice and some only prefer to have it with water. And I would say rakı oftentimes is diluted because itself is a very high alcohol percentage spirit. And since you are almost drinking it like a glass of wine, you have to bring it up to somewhere around of a wine strength. So when you dilute rakı in your glass, it's usually anywhere between 5 to 9% alcohol by volume. So it makes a perfect accompaniment to food, and it doesn't make you intoxicated as quickly as drinking it straight. Would it be possible to incorporate Rakı into cooking? Absolutely. You can definitely do that. And it can be used in baking. It can be used to cook some of the seafood dishes that is common in the Mediterranean. You can use it to flambe certain shellfish, for example, when you are cooking them on the pan. So it can definitely be used in many different ways. And that brings us to the end of our questions. So you should have a feedback poll that pops out in your screen as we speak right now. If you can very kindly please get back to us about what you thought about the webinar. And it was a absolute pleasure to have you in this webinar. Thank you for watching. And the recording of this webinar will be emailed to everyone as well as being available to watch on the WSET Events Hub on YouTube, where you can catch up on all our previous events, not just this webinar. To find out more and sign up for our wine, beer, spirits, sake qualifications, visit Where to Study, our Where to Study page at our main website, wsetglobal.com. Thank you so much for joining. See you later at another webinar.